Welcome to Tracy's Terrors. If you love horror and appreciate smart animal commentary, then you are in the right place. Today, Strigoi, VamPullet, and I will be discussing, and I apologize for mangling every name associated with this book, Hildur Knútsdóttir's 2024 novel, The Night Guest. A quick note before we begin, please subscribe to the channel. It gives Strigoi the inspiration that he needs to show up. Visit the website, tracysterrors.com, and follow us on social media. Anyone who has ever used a fitness tracker or biometric watch knows that the data these devices generate can have the unpleasant side effect of alienating you from your own body, transforming your body from an integral part of your overall self into what feels like an external object with quantifiable outputs. What's so clever about Knútsdóttir's novel, The Night Guest, is that it takes this disconcerting and distinctly modern experience, which we articulate in a figurative way, and makes it literal through the classic horror trope of the doppelganger. So it isn't as if the book's protagonist, Hildur, is disconnected from her body. She actually is, or so it seems. There's some ambiguity about that. The novel's thematic preoccupation with doubleness is cleverly mirrored, haha, no pun intended, in its style and structure, with its single sentence chapters and truncated narrative voice indicating the presence of an inaccessible and unknowable other. While I was completely on board with the first 3/4 of The Night Guest, I was underwhelmed by the ending, which uses the tired Freudian concept of repression to account for Hildur's sleepwalking. Still, if Knútsdóttir's reliance on a psychoanalytic model seems a little stale, the way that she leverages our inchoate fears surrounding health tracking technologies will resonate with anyone who has ever counted calories or steps, which at this point is pretty much everyone. So let's get into it. The Night Guest is a little bit like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde if the eponymous doctor had possessed a Fitbit. Hildur, a young Icelandic woman, has been suffering from extreme fatigue, which her doctor can't explain. Hoping that more exercise will increase her energy level, she purchases a pedometer to measure her physical activity. One night, she forgets to remove the device before going to bed, and in the morning, it indicates that she has taken 47,325 steps when she was supposed to be asleep. Every day, she has new bruises, and sometimes there's blood underneath her fingernails. Where has she been going, and why? Early in the novel, Hildur has a deep suspicion of tracking technologies, and she locates that danger where we all do, in outsiders, either individuals or agencies, who may gather the information for nefarious purposes. Knútsdóttir suggests that while concerns about hackers and government bureaucrats are legitimate and widely shared, we all fear that our information will be collected and misused, the real risk lies not so much in others monitoring us as in us monitoring ourselves. A cheery retail associate unwittingly hints at these perils when he outlines the creepy ways in which Hildur's pedometer will change how she relates to her own body. He says, quote, "You can send data automatically to a computer, put it in a graph, or display it any way you want, or automatically post your stats straight to Facebook," end quote. In other words, this gadget will allow Hildur to reduce her unified experience of selfhood into a series of abstract units, which she can then analyze, manipulate, and even make public. This all sounds vaguely menacing, but really, what's the harm in evaluating your movements and behaviors? The harm in it, at least in the world of horror fiction, is that through all of these assessments, you might realize the truth of your worst fears. Maybe your body really does have a separate existence, one that's governed by a consciousness bent on the destruction of the life that you've built. While Hildur's pedometer doesn't create this separate self, it merely captures something that already seems to exist, the centrality of a health tracking technology to the story gestures towards our anxieties about how these devices may warp our self-perceptions. Knútsdóttir heightens our inarticulate fears about losing touch with our bodies by giving these vague imaginings a very concrete and exaggerated form. While phone cameras and biometric watches are relatively new, the fears of self-alienation that they raise are very old, and Knútsdóttir explores them through the traditional trope of the doppelganger, that uncanny double described by Freud. Idunn is almost identical to her dead sister Ingrun, but the likeness is nonetheless slightly off. So when she meets Ingrun's ex-boyfriend, he stares at her, stunned by the dissonance between the familiar and the unfamiliar, the homely, as Freud would say, and the unhomely, which, according to him, defines the experience of the uncanny. Knútsdóttir deploys the doppelganger trope to greatest effect, really capturing the intense surrealist horror of it when Idunn watches a video of her sleepwalking self, and the recorded figure, who seems to be fully conscious, smirks maliciously at the camera. Through this constant play between similarity and difference, the self and not self, Knútsdóttir gives the novel a disorienting quality that adds an eerie depth to her sparing prose, a minimalist style that's instrumental in her portrayal of duality. Indeed, the extreme leanness of Idunn's voice points toward an internal psychological fissure that to me was just as frightening as any external enemy. The first-person narrative mode is a great way usually to explore interiority, because a protagonist's present thoughts, much like those of real people, will almost inevitably connect to their anxieties, past experiences, and their hopes for the future. Now, what's unusual about Idunn's perspective is that it is markedly restricted. For instance, we have almost no insight into her relationship with her sister Ingrun. And the few details we do have suggest that their dynamic was the typical big sister, little sister variety, characterized by the usual mix of adoration, jealousy, and petty cruelty. So why would Ingrun return from the dead to murder cats and crush her younger sibling? Clearly, there is something that Idunn isn't telling us about their shared history, and about so many other things. Her mind is full of forbidden zones, and these zones are given material form by the novel's numerous nearly empty chapters. It's in these absences that we sense the presence of another intelligence hidden within her, one that knows what she doesn't and that could fill in the gaps. In Knútsdóttir's hands, negative space on the page becomes content. Her strategically placed lacunae symbolize and create room in the text for a separate consciousness that's in abeyance when Idunn is awake. This mysterious entity could be so many things. Personally, I was hoping for some kind of alien influence, but the book isn't subtle in its preference for Freudian reading. I've used doppelganger and uncanny to discuss the ways in which a perceptual conflict between the familiar and the unfamiliar can create a sense of unease, and that's how most people use these terms nowadays. But while this tension is important to Freud, for him the deeper significance of these concepts has to do with repression. A doppelganger is the manifestation of unacknowledged anxieties, desires, and conflicts in a seemingly external body. Unfortunately, it's this aspect of the doppelganger on which Knútsdóttir relies the most. The Night Guest abounds with metaphors for Freud's two-part version of the self, and for the tenuous barrier, always on the verge of being breached, that keeps them separate. There are so many of these metaphors that despite the book's heroic attempts at maintaining ambiguity, it's too obvious that no genuinely external entity, neither Idunn's sister nor any other foreign presence, is responsible for what's happening to her. I held out hope that her repeated references to cosmic darkness were foreshadowing a Lovecraftian twist, a direction that would feel original in a story about a sleepwalking Icelandic woman. But instead, it ultimately follows the predictable path offered by old school psychology. And that's disappointing because from Psycho to Black Swan and to a dozen other movies I can't think of right now, it feels like repression is the answer to almost every horror mystery. While the ending of The Night Guest doesn't fulfill the promise of its intriguing premise, the novel is still worth reading for its really smart stylistic choices and innovative treatment of health tracking technologies. To me, these devices could drive at least a dozen different horror plots, but so far as I know, Knútsdóttir is the first to tap into their potential. Now, do you have a favorite piece of horror fiction that deals with health tracking technologies? If so, please leave it in the comments. I'd be interested to know. And also, if you like the show, subscribe to it. As I said, it keeps Strigoi inspired. Visit the website, tracysterrors.com. And thanks so much for joining us today. We'll see you next time.